Philosophy begins with Thales, says Russell. Philosophy begins in Miletus, says Allen. Many have followed Aristotle in taking the naturalists to be the first philosophers and scientists, says Irwin. And according to Aristotle, Thales was the first of the natural philosophers who sought to explain the world by reducing its various aspects to a common natural element. Point is, all these modern philosophers, ancient philosophers, all of them in this Western canon tell this story, and it is a story more than it is history, and I want to be real clear about that, because I'm telling a story of Western materialism, Western science and philosophy that has been retold. It is the canonical story, but it is not history in many ways, because to say Thales is the first philosopher is quite an insult to people elsewhere in the world doing philosophy. You get it. Okay, so this is a story. So his student and fellow Milesian, Anaximander, termed this element arche, the element being, he was saying that this first philosophy, the first school of philosophy says that everything reduces to a single element. Everything is made of something simple. And Anaximander calls it the arche. Homer used the word arche to mean mythical meaning of the mythical meaning of beginning, like the starting time. But Anaximander added the concept, the philosophical sense of origin or principle. So a starting place in arche is both the beginning temporally and the beginning, foundationally. So the idea, the first philosophers, according to Aristotle and ever since, in that canonical tradition, according to the story, philosophy began with Thales, philosophy began in Miletus, and the first philosophical premise was that everything reduces to substance, to matter. So, as the story is commonly told, the belief in an arche and the belief that it was material was the first premise and starting point of philosophical history. The evidence of unbiased common sense suggested that the world was constituted by visible matter, and, in accord with their newly naturalistic outlook, early Greek philosophers such as the Ionians and the atomists began regarding the heavens as composed of various material substances whose movements were mechanically determined. So, returning back to the same birthplace, the Eden of philosophy, as I'm going to call it, Miletus, where it started. It's also the place where atomism came from. Leucippus flourished around 440 BC, and Democritus Democritus brought Leucippus' ideas to Athens, and that was about 20 years later. And between the two, a theory emerged that would remain essentially unchanged, a quote of Guthrie's, until the 19th century. And in my dissertation, I have many quotes of many philosophers arguing that atomism is effectively stayed relatively unchanged until the 19th century. Some people who I don't agree with as much say until today. So this fixed stone of philosophical theory presented an image of reality as formed by space and matter, which they imagined to be microscopically small bits of pure being, whose size, shape, and motion necessitate mindless mechanical collisions, combinations of theoretically capable of constituting the macroscopic world we sense. Point being, little bitty bits of things, bouncing off of things, based on their shapes, based on their momentum, somehow make up this world that we see. Without simple alterations made by like Lucretius and Benjamin Franklin, who twist the theory, the strict materialism of the atom necessitates a belief in determinism. So without the recognition that particles exhibit the qualities of waves, which I'll talk about, it is impossible to conceive of an interpenetrative union between one atom and another. The universe of Democritus is made of fundamentally disparate atoms that interact in accordance with mechanical cause. So the idea is that atoms are like material things. They must stay separate from each other, and they're disparate. And fundamentally, everything is made up of fundamentally disparate things. That's the atomic theory. This theory was attacked and defended by Aristotle, and eventually transferred through Epicurus and the Stoics through Alexandria in Greece and Roman history before eventually serving as the foundation of Enlightenment science. So this really traveled a long, long range. So this seemingly soulless and purposeless explanation of a universe limited to the mechanical laws of matter, motion, and form eliminate a more mythic notion of justice. The Epicureans expanded on the materially grounded cosmos of the atomists to see the world as a great machine, with all its parts as material bodies acting in accordance with fixed rules set by nature. This perspective was picked up by Enlightenment philosophers and deists who famously viewed the cosmos as a clock. To simplify the imagery of efficient causation, the gears of the clock were sometimes envisioned through the mechanistic interactions of billiard balls. David Hume, for example, famously preferred this metaphor. So reflecting on the doctrine of necessity, this idea that, if this thing hits that thing, the standard cause will have a specific effect. So reflecting on this doctrine of necessity, Charles Sanders Peirce, one of my favorite philosophers of all time, he writes, the first advocate appears to have been Democritus, the atomist, who was led to it, as we are informed, by reflecting upon the impenetrability, translation, and impact of matter. Having restricted his attention to a field where no influence other than mechanical constraint could possibly come before his notice, he straightway jumped to the conclusion that throughout the universe, that was the sole principle of action, a style of reasoning usual in our day. The proposition in question is that the state of things existing at any time, together with certain immutable laws, completely determine the state of things at every other time. That's the doctrine of necessity. And this is a big part of, an inevitable part of simple atomism. Democritus ascribed to it, as did many later atomists. He also disbelieved in popular religion, and he considered that human belief in gods was no more than an attempt to explain extraordinary events, like thunderstorms or earthquakes, by means of imagined supernatural forces. He believed, contrary to religious myths we tell ourselves, that the first human beings lived a disorderly and bestial life. Fear, not intelligence, taught us to collect in groups, and in general need was itself the universal teacher for human beings. No fall. We just existed in an awful state of animalness until need drove us up. So so he shared these prototypical survival of the fittest and social contract, like interpretations of human social evolution, with Thucydides, Hobbes, and Freud. I'll leave it at that. So the reason I'm so interested, the dissertation is so focused on atomism, is because it consolidated a number of theories. Actually, that's not really that important. But the point is that all these pre-Socratic theories that I go through when I'm going through the history in the dissertation, atomism synthesizes many of them. The logos of Heraclitus, the materialism of Thales, the monism of Parmenides, the pluralism, all of these are combined into this atomic theory. So if one sees morality as relative, So if one sees morality as relative and self as an isolated arrangement of atoms, what ground reinforces love for others? I skipped something. Okay. But think of this. What I skipped is that effectively, if we are nothing but the material building blocks of our atoms bouncing around, how do we differentiate our brain from nature if it's just causally influenced by material interactions? At which point, how do we take responsibility for those actions? Where is free will in that space? And many people following this line of reason don't believe there's free will, and even modern scientists come to devalue, if not totally deny, consciousness and free will. One who accepts, so if one sees morality as relative in the self as an isolated arrangement of atoms, what ground reinforces love for others? The view of the self as isolated and arbitrarily created reinforces the potential to ignore and even devalue the inner experiences and concerns beyond one's inner space. One who accepts cultural relativism has stepped into the slippery slope towards two notably self-serving and or damaging positions. One, that there is neither objective morality nor a transcendent authority enforcing an objective moral code, which, two, leads many towards such an extreme interpretation of relativism that it borders on or becomes nihilistic, a belief in nothing at all. So they actually really didn't believe in free will, and Democritus argues, he's like, if we're no different than rocks and bees, and you don't blame a rock for falling, and so from this point of view, human beings in their minds are part of nature. They're composed of atoms, conforming to the same laws as other atoms. And so, though we often say we act because we've chosen to or decided to, we must be wrong. Peirce, again my favorite philosopher, he says, whosoever holds that every act of the will, as well as every idea of the mind, is under the rigid governance of a necessity coordinated with that of a physical world, will logically be carried to the proposition that minds are part of the physical world in such a sense that the laws of mechanics determine everything that happens according to immutable attractions, and propulsions. Such a perspective cannot logically stop short of making the whole action of the mind part of the physical universe. Consciousness in general thus becomes a mere illusory aspect of a material system. So, what these passages reveal, and this is that the atomic theory possesses the ability to inspire a set of beliefs that nurture an amoral ego. Belief that individuals are made of atoms in isolation, that morality is a human convention, that human nature is to seek power over other humans, and that no one is ultimately responsible for their actions. It is this dissertation's contention that these positions, through the continued prominence of atomism, continue to have a major influence on contemporary psyches in the Western world. And this is not to say, on the other hand, that such reinforcement of the self-asserting ego is unmitigatingly negative. So, it is important. The egos. So, as I will continue to address, the emergence of the self-authority gives rise to significant benefits. In what seems like a paradoxical schism in concert, one recognizes the self-liberating lack of responsibility suggested by determinism, reinforcing the self-liberated image that the radical atom empowers. So, I mentioned there are some Americans who got into this. So, the American forefathers like Jefferson and Franklin were heavily influenced by atomism, and they were deist, Enlightenment intellectuals. And what's key to notice is that the contemporary global community that it was initiated during the Enlightenment was not just founded on the democratic revival and its revolution against tyrannies of the kings and popes. It was born from an entire paradigm of Enlightenment thought, in which atomism and democracy were only topically divisible. At their foundations, they are both founded on a vision of interacting subjects and objects that possess distinct individualities, deserving of rights. So, all these different revolutions, which we talked about in the context of Prometheus, the figure of revolution, are also very much empowered by the scientific. I mean, think about it. You got this guy saying God says this, and this guy saying the state says that. Until you're really sure, it's going to be really hard to rebel against one of those authorities. So the Enlightenment paradigm that Newton really is hugely responsible for, it finally gave, always scientists and philosophers wanted to say everything is scientifically explainable, everything's mechanically explainable, but until Newton, that was just like, I guess, I predict. Newton actually showed us, like, man, this is how things interact. And just a normal person doesn't even take advanced calculus for a normal person to just look a little bit at Newton's model and understand it. And that strength of that scientific paradigm and the conviction that so many people were able to develop around the simplicity of that paradigm, that gave such conviction that people were able to rebel against religious authorities at that time. They were able to rebel against state authorities at that time on the strength of the paradigm that I'm trying to tear down. So, but it's very important. So Pascal actually directly associates the atom with his vision of the self as isolated. In an existential-like state of despair, he writes, I behold the vast distances of the universe that contains me, and find myself confined to a corner of this vast body, not knowing wherefore I am placed rather in this place than another, nor why this little time allotted to me to live is assigned me at this point rather than any other, or that eternity is gone before, or shall follow after me. I see nothing but infinities on all sides that swallow me up like an atom, and like a shadow that remains but a moment and passeth away. So, and then I've gone through in the dissertation many other philosophers who make this same analogy of the atom to describe the self and the self's experience of isolation. The atom becomes a symbol of isolation, even especially for philosophers. Tarnas echoes this image when he describes the contemporary cosmological tendency to objectify the world and turn the human self into an object, which he considers an ephemeral side effect of a randomized universe that results in the image of oneself as an isolated atom in mass society, a statistic, a commodity, a passive prey to the demands of the market, a prisoner of the self-constructed modern iron cage.
Not to mention boring.
It's
a boring paradigm.
It is a boring paradigm. I mean, yeah. So we're almost done here. As we've seen with Democritus and Epicureans, the reduction of the self and soul to its body is theoretical consequences. The metaphor of a classical atom is as matter with distinct and impervious boundaries. Constellating this microcosmic image with the microcosmic image of self is to see the material boundaries of the body as limits of the isolated self. So the skin becomes the shell of the atom, becomes the skin of the fruit. As we noted in our, looking at Tillich, we didn't look at Tillich, looking at Pascal, we noted that this conflation between atom and self. And if atomism can be seen as a foundational to a paradigm of thought, if atomism reinforces an isolative self-image, and if the sense of self-isolation fuels existential anxiety, then it can be seen that where classical atomism is foundational to a cosmology, then those committed to that intellectual paradigm are extremely vulnerable to the existential anxiety exacerbated by isolation. And again, it's important to many people to note that I'm not just slandering the ego. There's much importance to the ego. So that is where I'm going to stop with that particular. You can see that if you project yourself into the stones or into the atoms, you necessarily see yourself as an isolation. I'm isolated in my skin. I can't be one with my family. I can't be one with nature. I can't be one with God. I can't be one with anything because I see myself as made up of fundamentally isolated bits of matter. In fact, it's hard to even imagine myself as unified. You can only imagine a synchronization of many isolated bits, fundamentally. However, in 1905, the 26-year-old Einstein, having failed to prepare to receive an academic position, was supporting himself and his young family by working in a Swiss patent office. Working in his spare time, he wrote 6 history-making papers, a creative outburst rivaled only by the work of the young Isaac Newton, who holed up at his mother's home to escape the plague, developed calculus, an analysis of the light spectrum, and the laws of gravity. In 1905, Einstein laid the foundations for 2 great advances of 20th century physics, relativity and quantum theory. At the heart of his paper were questions that were bedeviling physics, and in fact have done so from the time of the ancient Greeks until today. Is the universe made up of particles, such as atoms, or is it an unbroken continuum? So, that's the end of that story. Well, and what's not, I got to tell you what he did. So Einstein did 2 major things I want to focus on. We've talked about 2 main parts of materialism. One, this idea of the material shape of the material, right? The isolated shape. 2 is just to say that everything is matter. We all know the E equals MC squared statement. That is to say that matter is not the fundamental foundation of reality, that beneath matter is energy, or alongside of matter. We can say any way you want to look at it, any way you want to interpret it, we can very clearly say that to reduce the universe to matter is outdated, thanks to Einstein. Because he shows that everything is also transmutable into energy. The second is, funny twist, the atom was never actually proven during the classical period. It was just a theory. Einstein, however, through Brownian motion, proved the existence of the atom, and he's the one credited for proving the existence of the atom. Funny, because he's going to be the one that completely undermines its form. So what happens is, he comes up with this idea of the photon. He doesn't call it a photon, he calls it a quanta, but the idea is that a particle and a wave combine to make a single entity that make up the foundation of reality. So the reality is not based on material, and it's not based on atoms or particles. At the foundation, each particle is also a wave. We're going to talk about that more. Yes, this is the time to do it. Okay. Because next we're going to transition into actual conclusion conversation. These are the stories. We're done with the stories. So here's the huge segue. And this is maybe the biggest insight of my life. And the biggest challenge of my life. How does a speaker play back all the music that an entire symphony orchestra can record? A single cone speaker, a single one in my ear, a single eardrum, a single wire. How does that happen? Because I see manyness. And as a kid, that drove me nuts. Because I was stuck in the paradigm of atomism before I even knew what an atom was. So, turns out, if we were to all, have musical instruments, if we threw those physical, material musical instruments into the center of the room, just like atoms, they would stay isolated. You break them up, they still stay in isolated bits. However, if we all play music and we put a microphone in the middle of the room, that microphone will record every single wave from every single note that all of us play. Every overtone, every finger noise on the string will all be recorded as a single wave by the microphone. And the way that the speaker can play back all that music is because it can synthesize all the waves that everything makes into a single, one-dimensional vibration pattern. So, you don't like that, Garrison. What do you think? Two-dimensional? You want two dimensions?
Cone?
On the cone. Because it's just going back and forth. All it's doing is like this.
That's just one dimension.
That's one-dimensional. All right. So, so the point is that where atoms have a big problem with one and manyness, and a big problem with isolation, waves have no problem with one and manyness or with isolation. And now we've stumbled into perhaps one of the greatest existential spiritual problems of all of human history, which is oneness and manyness. And how can I be both individual and free, yet unified with all? And most spiritual religious seekers would really like a solution to that problem. How can I be me, and how can I be one with all? Atomism offers no real solution to this unless you just want to see yourself as a synchronized part of a deterministic plan. That's the best they got for you. However, waves, as mentioned, have no problem with one and manyness. So, let's stop there. See if you guys have a couple questions, and then I'm going to conclude. How much to read? So each of the three narratives of knowledge studied throughout this dissertation present a meta-narrative that begins with an entry of the psyche into an engagement with matter. This narrative arc is then defined by material transcendence. Prometheus is freed from stone, Adam from his cave, and, in the context of divine union and escape from mortal isolation, the material remains of Christ and Heracles cannot be found in the pyre or tomb, as will be dictated by the matrix of mortal materiality. Miming this sequence as philosophy and science were triggered by the materialistic and atomistic foundations of Thales and Democritus, Western intellectual thought has since been refounded by Einstein's theory of mass's convertibility to energy and his Grailstone-like particle, the photon, which synthesized particles and waves into a single microcosmic image. Einstein's influence on the departicularization of matter and dematerialization of particles depended on the integration of waves into a theory of matter. Congruently, the transcendence from matter enacted by Heracles and Christ was triggered by the symbolic integration or addition of fluids. Now here's the big piece. So, okay. Hydra-blood was responsible for the liberation of Prometheus from stone and Heracles from his body. He then drank divine nectar to effect his divinization. Blood also liberated Adam from stone and flowed at Christ's death, which he drank in the form of wine at the Last Supper and in the afterlife before it became an essential symbol of divine immortality in the forms of Catholic Mass and the European Grail romances. So, the point is that my main point is that the wave form, before like 100, 200, 150 years ago, we didn't know about the invisible world. We didn't know about electromagnetic waves. We didn't know about sound waves. I'm not even sure when we figured out that sound was propagated as waves, right? The experience of the invisible world has been increasingly apparent to us as we engage in science. The visible world, however, does convey the shape of a wave. Sometimes you see it in interesting places, but the very most obvious form of the wave is in fluid. So, so here's the big step, that the challenge of isolation is overcome by the form of the wave. So, scientifically, it's conveyed by the integration of the wave into the particle. In the religious and mythological traditions, it's symbolized by a fluid. And this is my theory for why the elixir is the elixir, for why the Holy Grail is the Holy Grail, for why the fluid is that which makes the transition from isolation into union, because the fluid carries the form which enables union. So, that is the essence of my whole dissertation, that the fluid and the wave both carry the same form and both enable union with anything. So if I now see myself not just as particle, not just as matter, but also as all the waves that I am, electromagnetic, gravitational, and everything else, one of the things that's interesting about waves, my matter has a very clear skin boundary. whereas waves are continuous. They don't ever actually end. They just approach zero forever. So there are no hard boundaries between anything. There's not even a hard boundary between me and the furthest star away in the universe. But there's a hard boundary materially. So we can now see, and I'm not going to get into all the deep ways that many people have been talking about waves and fields as crucial to spiritual enlightenment and even New Age movements and all kinds of things, new physics. But I will say, metaphysically, that breakthrough to the field, to the wave, is a conceptual breakthrough that allows for union, which is a conceptual pursuit, I believe, a spiritual pursuit of anybody seeking union with the divine, union with a lover, union with nature, union with anything. This, I believe, is the fundamental metaphysic for union. And I believe that putting the finger on what that metaphysic is, the metaphysic beneath love, gives substantial strength to go against the metaphysic of atomism, that those opposing it just say they can only be in negative, as opposed to have a new positive to challenge it with. So this is, I hope that's what this can be. And we can open for questions.